I am delighted to be speaking once again with Jason Baxter. Hi there, Jason.
Hey,
We spoke before about your book on C.S. Lewis, and drew out all sorts of aspects of Lewis and his medieval imagination, particularly, which is what your book's about, which I really enjoyed. And we're meeting now because you have produced a translation of one of Lewis's, at least part of one of Lewis's favorite books, Dante's Divine Comedy, the Inferno. Just while I've got the
yes.
book held up here, people should note the front cover, which has an image of Giotto's deposition of Christ. And I want to return to that because it is a not immediately obvious image to put on the front cover. But people may also know that part of my interest in the Divine Comedy, if you give a second book plug, is that I too have produced a book on Dante, not a translation, but a sort of commentary and introduction that goes through the whole thing, including the Inferno. Um, so, look, lovers of Dante both. Um, I mean, what's it like to have translated it? As someone who um, has to read it in comparative translations to get through it, what's it like to actually engage with the text itself?
Love that question. Uh, I think I could say a million things on that, but my goal when I began this, I thought I wanted to get close to the master, and I kept having this piano metaphor in my mind. Not that I'm a good pianist, but I'm just good enough to know what a good pianist is like. Um, and I kept remembering as a kid when I would memorize a piece, and then I could put the music away and I could close my eyes and I could play the piece on the piano and I would stop feeling it in my eyes and in my head and I would start to feel it in my nerves and in my pulse and in my hands and almost sort of in my heart. And I wanted to do that to the extent I could with the master, with Dante. And it seemed to me like translating would force that because you wouldn't just be paying attention to the ideas, but you'd be paying attention to how they come about and what it feels like to encounter them. And you have to come across all those little conjunctions. And in the middle of that whole process, I made a lot of discoveries, which almost kind of, scientific lab like, then forced me to go back to the beginning and have a more accurate understanding of what I was doing. But one of the, that was one sort of exciting discovery is I felt that I jokingly discovered Dante's heartbeat. And what I mean by that is I remember when you have to, go word by word painstakingly over like crawling on your hands and knees through hell, with each sort of conjunction and each sort of adverb. I kept being struck by how often Dante would do a couple of things. For instance, he would just say "edeli," and he with no verb, and he replied or he said. But in some sense, it struck me because Dante had a kind of impatience just to get through those words to get back to the thing, get back to the narrative. And there are other points where he kept using and then edinde. And it struck me that Dante's poem, with respect to everything that he had done before, the poetry that he said he wanted to write was more aggressive and more abrupt and what we could call more paratactic. You could say more Hemingway than Milton, more Hemingway than Dickens, and that it seemed to me, and again, this is only a metaphor of how I was kind of thinking into it, because we have to historicize these concepts. But it seemed to me that Dante was doing something kind of film noir. He was adding a heartbeat, or he's adding a sort of breathing sound into the soundtrack. And when you remember that Dante is also one of the first to both be the poet and also the first person narrator, then creates all kinds of cinematic possibilities for what this poem can feel like from the inside. That is, he's not just the omniscient, novelist who knows all the emotions that his characters are going through, but he has all the sort of failed knowledge and the first person experiences of going on the journey himself, or sort of represents it, that what we could say with the filmmakers, the point of view shot. So that was one kind of exciting discovery. And then the other one, and here's the homage to the master, is that I'm really excited. In the end, I'm really excited about what happened. I went through all kinds of experiences of emotions, which that's why it's dedicated to my poor wife, because she had to like therapeutically deal with me for about 9 months. At times I thought, this is really good. And I'd read a passage to my friends and they'd be excited. And I thought, this is great. This is liberating something which, we need to capture in English. At other points, I was completely discouraged and depressed and thought it was a garbage translation. I was ready to delete it. In the final analysis, I like how it came out, but I also became very cognizant of how much we were leaving behind, and how when you're dealing with a master who has geological layers upon layers of technique and sounds, and including just things that we just can't reduplicate in English, just because of the very different structures of our language, right? Like clusters of vowel sounds in Italian. Dante's Surprise, surprise, Dante's Italian is very musical, and he gets a lot out of his vowel sounds in a way that I don't think makes any sense for us. Where sometimes Dante says that harsh consonant clusters like the CH sound or the double X or the double Z or something like that seems to really grate him and irritate him, and which is not something that happens in our Anglo-Saxon, language, which is, kind of half Danish, half French, right? And so seeing how much I had to leave in the poem, even if I was, B plus in an American grading system, right? A B plus, satisfied with what I did, and well, I would say A minus, satisfied with what I did. Um, I think that was the really exciting thing, was to see how rich this thing was, and hopefully uses some techniques in English to get across some of the dynamism and some of the power. And I think that's why I'm most excited about this translation. But in the end, just having eyes to see what I had to leave behind. And just to come full circle, I play a little Bach piece, I have a little Bach book. It's an intermediate level Bach book, and I'm terrible at it. But I can play a little fugue or a little prelude just well enough to see how much is left in the original. And I think analogously to spend years, 5 years, trying to pull this thing over into English, and going over this thing word by word by word by word, again and again and again, and reading it to multiple audiences until everything felt right. I still think it's just such a testimony to the master's subtlety and craft, that as much as I tried, he's still better.
Well, I guess that is good, because it partly, in a way, another way of saying what you're saying, I think, is that it's an inspired text, and you can return to it again and again and again and see something different each time. And that is partly what brilliance of language can do. It's as much what the words intimate or convey, aside from what is explicit, that is important. And certainly I think that's true in a work like the Divine Comedy. And the edge of words, as Rowan Williams has put it, matters. And of course, that's what poetry is so good at drawing attention to. Just to say, I mean, your translation comes across to me as having that direct quality, that sense of realism, that you do feel right alongside Dante, walking from the dark woods through the gates of hell and down. And that really matters to me. I'm basically a realist about the Divine Comedy, that this is describing something to us that is not just direct in language, but is direct in experience, if we have the eyes to see. And
That's good. That was really important to me. I wanted to get that heartbeat, that sort of lived physiological condition into the poem, in part, right, just because this is an apocalyptic landscape. An ideal text to read in our age. It's weirdly urgent. It feels like Dante had already sort of seen in a crystal ball all of our news and all of our elections and all of our frauds and scandals, and it feels absolutely urgent and contemporary. But at the same time, at least by getting that thumping heartbeat, it also prepares us for, I think, some of those passages that Dante was most proud of, the ones that float, the ones that slow down, the ones that create what I like to call slow time. And then this is what Dante thought that he was a specialist at in his early poetry. And he has a wonderful Latin term for it. He calls it prolixitas, right? or this kind of slow ambling of it. But he thought that his sort of expertise was creating slow time, almost kind of, we've already mentioned the cover um, and how important Giotto might have been for Dante. But I think Dante thought that he was almost creating something painterly, something visual. He was creating sort of verbal icons. And that's, of course, what he was trying to do in his early years when he was writing about Beatrice, is create these types of verbal icons. And so that prolixitas, or that slowness, or that floating quality, that gliding quality, as Lewis put it when he first read Paradiso, when he was writing to Owen Barfield, right? Or was it Arthur? Anyway, one of the two, reading with Owen, writing to Arthur, that has this sort of floating, gliding quality. I wanted that to stick out as well. And I think so in part by getting the heartbeat and the hurried pace, the physiological pace that you mentioned, allows us to see those types of moments in which these larger cosmological patterns of harmony are trying to make themselves expressed in the background of the poem, which the poet can hear, obviously, because he wrote them, but the poet can hear even if the characters and Dante the Pilgrim, especially in Inferno, can't hear yet. Later, that will become more evident, and that will begin to sort of move from the background into the foreground. But I think that's a really, really exciting musical quality of the very sort of rhythmical pacing of how the narrative content unfolds, and the poem in some sense will get denser and slower as we get higher and higher.
Yeah, that's very interesting because it is written at a pace where things are constantly changing, and yet not so fast that you aren't constantly in the moment as well. You know, each canto has a different feel, and is almost a world unto itself. Certainly in the Inferno, and yet you can be fully immersed in that moment before being led into the next. And I think that's important for its realism, because although Dante sees what he sees in the Inferno, and I'm sure if and when I go there, or you go there, we would see different things, because it's a very reflexive kind of experience. It's psychological as much as anything else. And so what we are able to see is what shows up, or maybe in the Inferno, what we expect to see is what shows up, because we're not really capable of seeing anything else in an infernal state of mind. But nonetheless, it has that universal quality, certainly for those of us who live since the birth of the Reformation. So look, you mentioned Giotto and the image which you have on the cover here, the deposition with Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Jesus. Why this image on the front cover?
Yes. We had two different candidates for the image cover. There was this one of Mary, the Mother of God, lamenting over the death of Christ, holding his limp, flaccid, sallow body and grieving over him. And then the other one was also from the Arena Chapel, the Scrovegni Chapel of Giotto, of Judas Iscariot. And it's hard to tell exactly what moment it is. It's either Judas just about to kiss the Lord, or just having pulled away from him, having betrayed him. And the eyes of Christ are perfectly fixed on Judas's face. And Judas, it's a kind of a gorgeous, iconic moment, sees himself being seen. And he's sort of, in this incredible moment of spiritual nudity, can't hide anything in his soul from the Lord, and it's very, very powerful. So both of those were candidates, and unfortunately, you can't put two images on the cover. But I think both of them would have worked. And the reason I think that they're so powerful is I love what you said earlier about the traces of Christ being everywhere in Inferno, even if we don't encounter him directly. Part of one of my favorite aspects to try to draw out in the interpretation is this wonderful line at the beginning of Inferno 4, where Virgil tells Dante that they have now come into a place, and the virtuous of the classical virtuous among limbo, in which they do not suffer any direct punishment, and they merely suffer the loss of the good of the intellect, il ben d'intelletto, the loss of the good of the intellect. And I think when Virgil says merely, He doesn't mean just, or he means purely. And these are the virtuous souls who, having dedicated their lives to, to great epic feats of virtue, or philosophical or scientific achievements, sort of came to the edge of their lives, but yet didn't pass into a sort of messianic state of hope, in which they recognized their own Christological need for salvation. And so here in hell, to lose the good of the intellect, my sort of read on that is that all these, that in Inferno 4, the most virtuous are able to see what they've lost. Now, they are not able to convert. Um, they're not able to embrace, embrace Christ in this salvific way. But now they are able to recognize what they have lost. They've lost the good of the intellect. They've lost the good of the, and Boethius calls it the intelligentsia. They've lost the pearl of great price. They've lost the thing to which the deepest parts of the intellect, what the deepest parts of the intellects yearn and long for, and now they can feel that loss. So if this is the case, then first of all, we have to say that, unlike some contemporary theologians who don't necessarily need to be named, Dante's Inferno is much more subtle than mere sort of cruelty and sadism and infliction of punishments on people, because it's psychologically driven by this sort of pained recognition of the loss of the good of the intellect. If this is also true, then it means that what the modernist poets like Eliot and Samuel Beckett noticed in the Inferno, this kind of weird, non-funny comedy in which all kinds of bustle and what I like to call bottomless scrolling on the periphery of our being occurs, right? Think Waiting for Godot. What that means is that these souls who are suffering in the deepest part, this deep wound of the loss of Christ, and yet are not worthy enough to focus on it, not sort of virtuous enough to focus on it, rather cast themselves into the particular punishments and take a weird kind of, zealous embracing of these things. If you just sort of think of Muhammad, right, who not only is divided by cruel demons, but leans into it and begins to divide himself. My sort of read then is that part of the magic of Dante's poem is that we see sinners, we see ourselves engaged in a constant process of self-distraction, so that we don't focus on the internal loss, which is at the root of the heart. And that's why the image is on the cover, and that's why it could have also been sort of Judas Iscariot, because I think that Giotto psychologically captures the power in which we are seen by Christ, and it hurts too much to touch. And thus, part of the kind of weird zaniness, if you think of also the sort of bariters in the early 20s of Inferno, right? The kind of weird dark comedy in which no one's laughing. Part of that tone, that very modernist tone, is this intentional process of self-distraction, because it hurts too bad to touch the loss of the intellect. That's why the image is on the cover.
That's very fascinating. I love that you're trying to capture in the translation, but also explicating now the subtleties of the Inferno, because it's one of the awful things about the way that it's entered a secular popular culture, is just as if it's about X sin getting flung into Y circle, and as if there's some sort of calculus involved. It's not about calculus, I don't think, at all. And when that is, Dante, of course, deals with that sense that that's what condemnation is about, and sort of mocks it, I think, and says, no, always is saying to us, no, look harder. And that is, in a way, to invoke the intellect there in a subtler way, which is to say, constantly asking, what are you missing? And then bringing together not just intellect as in sort of reason, but also intellect. You mentioned yearning, I think, of the loss that sparked of love, and Dante still lived in a time when those two aspects of intelligence went very naturally together. We can only understand what we yearn for, and, as it were, turn our mind towards. And so loss is an act of beginning to turn, at least. And it makes me think, the beginning of the Purgatory, when Dante encounters Cato, the famous Stoic, and they talk about reason on one hand, in the sense of sort of law and logos, but adding this dimension of love. Virgil asks Cato about his wife, and this sort of stirs the remembrance of loving Cato, as if that is what he's got to work on, got to bring to mind in order to presumably, make his own ascent up Mount Purgatory. And it's these kind of things which I think means that actually at the end of the day, to really jump to a big conclusion, that Dante is not saying that hell is a place where people for all eternity are left, as if by a sort of puritanical deity. Certainly people in hell feel like it's for all eternity, but that's what it's like to feel trapped in a hellish state of mind. But I think constantly there's this sense that even in hell, there's the possibility of remembering more. And another way of putting it, I think, is that if that wasn't the case, then all these beings would just fall out of being altogether. No part of them, as it were, would be connected to the divine being, and they would just drop out of existence altogether. And there's another bit, I forget the canto exactly, but you probably will remember, but where they encounter the figure, I forget his name, who rises up out of the mud, and they have some sort of exchange, and then there's the word is something like, he glimpsed or he glanced, and then he sort of falls back. And every so often there are these kind of encounters where it's almost as if something occurs to the figure, but then they're just not able to hold on to it or take it in, and they fall back into the hellish state of mind.
Yes, I'm glad you've recognized that too. The in Inferno 6 with Chaco,
Thanks so much. Yeah,
sort of talking about among the glutton, among the gluttonous. And so I always just sort of with my students, I always say, imagine the party life, right? Imagine the fraternity brother here. But it seems to me that there's this incredible moment, you're right, having seen something, he flips a switch and goes from his lucid consciousness to a preferable state of unconsciousness. I just don't want to think about it anymore. Now, in that way, I think we actually see a sort of echo of the whole kind of, engagement in the gluttonous life, the wild party life, right? I don't want to deal with that right now. I'm just going to flip the switch off, and I'm going to pretend that it's not there by, whatever means. But I think we see that, and I just encourage those who are listening to this to, when you read the speeches, especially the sort of great speeches of Chaco, say, of Farinata later, right, of the suicides in 13, right, and of Piero della Vigne, of Brunetto Latini, of course, of Ulysses, and Ugolino later on. I think what is most interesting to me is that as they talk, they get very, very close to that inner wound, which has that sort of inflamed tenderness. And just as they begin to touch it, just as they begin to touch on the sort of root causes of their life, it begins to hurt again, and they quickly move away from it, distract themselves in their own, in what makes the most sense to their own peculiar temperament. They either do what Chaco does and flip the switch of unconsciousness and say, all right, I'm out. Or they grow angry again, or they change the subject to go talk about, yes, but the other political party engaged in grievous wounds against mine. But in some sense, having come to the root moment, right? The encounter with the face of Christ, of Jesus Christ looking into the face of Judas Iscariot, they have the moment all over again. And I think at least in that much we're in agreement, that my sort of suggestion is that they can't eradicate the whispering voice of God, even in hell, God is there. And I say this toward the end of the introduction. I think it's just so relevant. God is near to his broken and miserable people, even in hell. God is near to his broken and miserable people, even if they won't or can't acknowledge his secret and invisible presence. Even in hell, he in some way beckons to them through the ineradicable secret whispering of the human heart, even if they engage in violence in order to ignore it. And so too does Dante, the godlike poet, who models himself on the infinite maker, take up those little words with their rough and broken syllables and weave them into a symphony of power and weight and majesty and height and depth. But yes, I think we see this kind of we can call them, at least at this stage in Dante's encounter. And Mark, I like your hopeful eschatological vision for the fullness of infernal time. Um, but at least in this sort of particular moment, these all these characters are kind of failed Augustines, right? And if you remember sort of Confessions and sort of particularly Augustine's own sort of searching through his memory, looking for this core moment, what I call his inner infancy, right? That Augustine uses the fullness of his adult rationality and his adult rhetoric in order to rediscover his inner spiritual infant without necessarily also sloughing off the good parts of being an adult, but to sort of establish his relationship with his own first encounters with Christ. In that case, all the souls in hell are failed Augustines. They begin going on the descent into the heart, and they get very, very close to the center of the heart where they could hear the whispering voice, but then they touch that wound, they touch that loss of the good of the intellect, and it hurts. And so they jerk back to the periphery of their beings and distract themselves in whatever way makes most logical sense for their character and temperament.
Yeah, that's very important because there's no, I don't think, final answer to the problem of suffering. But certainly this wisdom that the way down and the way up are somehow one and the same, and that Dante is promised right at the beginning of the Inferno that his this journey is going to bring him to the heavenly places, and yet there's no shortcut. It has to begin through the gates of hell, and that is this encounter, I guess, with oneself, that it is the pain of having to let go of oneself, and all the complaints and justifications and rationales, that we can order to try and preserve our sense of ourselves as isolated, or at least sort of independently worthy figures, if you like, not with the dependency upon God. But at the same time, sort of slightly in defense of the figures trapped in hell, it's not at all straightforward just to sort of let go of oneself as well. And because we are at the same time called to be, I think, free spiritual creatures who can become fully aware of the divine life within us, not just sort of subsumed into an amorphous light. And of course, that is partly what unfolds in the paradise, Dante learning that. Yeah, so
May I
it's
just
right
add
that
something
it's
there?
right that the 34 cantos teasing this business out, because it's not just straight, it's not straightforward at all. You've got to sort of feel it, as you're saying.
Yeah, to say that part of the magic of Dante's Inferno is that even in the midst while we're watching this dramatic irony of these souls, and then we know more about them than they know about themselves, right? That we sort of roll our eyes when Farinata goes into, yet again, the old, culture war debates. Like, really, we're hearing this again, Farinata? Farinata's fixed on the sort of like, the news of 50 years ago. And he goes over these arguments again and again and again and again. And he seems to want to engage Dante in that, right? But although we might have, as readers, a sense of sort of dramatic irony, nevertheless, these characters are really shockingly admirable, and we really like them and we really admire them, sometimes even in the midst of the rebellion. If we think of someone like Ulysses. In fact, the Italians admire Ulysses so much as scholars that there's a long tradition of saying that Dante thought that he probably shouldn't have been in hell, right? That Dante made him so admirable and so noble that it's hard for anyone to see that he belongs there. But in any case, I think what even there, what Dante's sort of doing, and I think what you're suggesting is that the sort of dignity of our own agency and the dignity of our own freedom, and that we do have this incredible privilege of, through prudence, shaping our own virtuous actions in our own historical time, that this is an essential quality of being a human being. And thus we admire it even in hell, even if it's also lost access to this openness to the transformative power of divine love.
I mean, for me, at the end of the day, I think that the Inferno is a bit like a dream, a very elaborate, extended, lucid, waking dream in Dante's case. And so the figures that he encounters are really aspects of himself projected onto those figures. So I don't think he's ever really saying, I saw Ulysses in hell and he's definitely there. But the reason why there's this extraordinary encounter with this amazing speech is that Dante, in seeing Ulysses, unlike some of the other people that he meets, who he more or less just passes without by or leave, is because there's something so profound for him to understand in terms of this encounter. And then
Yeah.
you mentioned Muhammad as well there. You know, one of the, I find, very uncomfortable moments when they come to the Malabolgia, the Bolgia, where Muhammad and Ali and others, Bertrand de Born, very memorably carrying his head around like a lantern as well. And I think this is a really crucial canto to understand because, this is my theory. It's the one canto, I think, where the word contrapasso is actually used by Dante. And contrapasso, you'll have a better translation, but it's sort of the punishment fits the crime in a rather mechanistic, transactional sense of the cosmos and God's action within it. And I think that it's also, though, the canto where Dante the fundamentalist really comes out. And so he sees Muhammad there because in his most sort of black and white states of mind, Islam is the schismatic threat to the Western world, to Christendom, and that comes out because Bertrand de Born, who's carrying his head around as if it's a lantern, can literally only see by his own light. And I think using the word contrapasso, therefore, in this canto is Dante saying to us, don't interpret this whole thing as if it's just that maps onto this, and therefore you've got the whole thing sorted, almost like a kind of sentencing list that I'm giving you here, maybe in part to get back at my enemies, maybe in part to cause consternation. No, I think the fact that this contrapasso word appears in the fundamentalist canto, as I think of it, is Dante precisely saying, don't go in that direction, because otherwise you get stuck in this canto too, and you can only see by your own light.
Yes, there's a lot of powerful interpretations. I think, I don't know about all the details, but I think in general, I think we agree that part of the excitement and part of the brilliance is that Dante, the character, is not a properly formed, fully formed soul yet, and that his reactions and and Virgil too, who's a resident of the dark places, of the abyss of darkness, also is not a perfectly reliable guide, and that we sort of encounter Dante almost in kind of in an infancy or adolescence of his own spiritual life, and he might be sort of working out the necessary responses, but they might not be coming in just measure, or they might not be sort of counterbalanced. There you go, contrapasso. They might not be sort of counterbalanced with all the virtues and spiritual responses needed. And so again, the musical metaphors haunt my imagination, right? If the comedy is going to be a fugue, in which we need these sort of multiple melodic themes, then I think at least one of those, and I think this is one of the more uncomfortable things for us. One of them is that there's a righteous aspect of anger. Dante thinks, Aquinas thinks, that you can sin by not being angry enough, and that there is a kind of righteous demand for justice and the sort of like, adopting the voice of the psalmist. And some of those particular applications, I think, are difficult for us. But if in whatever capacity, whatever that looks like, if there's some aspect of righteous anger and longing for justice, nevertheless, and I think this is Dante's brilliance, if that's the only thing we had, and maybe you could even just say that the fundamentalist has exclusive access to righteous anger and desire for justice, then we're actually truncated human beings. Truncated human beings, just like Bertrand de Born, right? not necessarily because those are not sort of like primary colors in the moral universe, but if you only painted your painting with blues, you know, uh, uh, Picasso accepted, right? It's not going to be a very interesting painting. That in addition to righteous anger, in addition to desire for justice, again, whatever that looks like, is also a desire for mercy, is also a sense of sympathy, is also a sense of tragic loss, is also a sense of humor, which Virgil does not allow Dante to have at any point whatsoever. The guy who's writing the comedy is not supposed to be funny in any possible way. That seems that Virgil's missing something there. It's like Virgil is the Virgil is the instructor who teaches Dante the scales and the chords, but he doesn't know how to put them all together into the fugal composition. Now that's in part because Virgil has not yet enjoyed the climb up the mountain, if enjoy is the right word, the painful climb up the mountain, and then ultimately the incredible celestial ascent, which will enable the poet to have the fugal composition, even if his particular character is still like the kid at the piano playing out his scales and chords, but badly because he hasn't yet put them together.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. Um, the figure of Virgil is creeping in on our conversation, and Virgil's ultimate destiny, of course, is another big question amongst Dante readers. I mean, to my mind, the fact that he can climb Mount Purgatory means that he's on a journey out of hell, because if you weren't, then you couldn't be in that place. You couldn't see what you can see. And although you're right, he's not a reliable guide all the time.
Not yet.
At times he is, and one of the things which actually always surprises me about Virgil in Purgatory is that he knows that why you can't climb by night. He does understand something about the dynamics of light and darkness, and that perhaps relates back to what we were talking about, the intelligence earlier.
Well,
But
there is an incredible moment at the end of Purgatory where Dante, you'll remember, I think it's Purgatorio 29. Dante turns to Virgil to ask him for help in understanding the spiritual radioactivity of the vision that's being thrust upon them, and Virgil is completely stupefied. I jokingly call him avuncular Virgil, right? Sententious avuncular Virgil, who always has the right sort of, now Dante, you need to do this, right? In his best sort of dad voice, right? Here, of course, is is stupefied and just stares in blank awe and amazement, right? It sounds like how Rudolf Otto describes the experience of the numinous, right? Blank stupor and amazement. Now that very experience of realizing that you've failed to possess adequate words is also something that Gregory the Great experiences when he gets to, Dante says, when he gets to Paradiso and realizes that his angiology was wrong and the angiology of Dionysius the Areopagite was right. And he looks and bursts out laughing at how wrong he had been. This might be one of the sort of first moments in which Virgil recognizes by how far his intellect, and yeah, I think you're right, it's a little bit earlier in Purgatory too, but one of the first major moments in which he realizes by how far his intellect has failed to grasp the totality of things. Um, if Dante's doing that, then I think we might have some good reason for hope for Virgil, because he's walked himself into a messianic state of expectation, in which he says, "Oh, really, Lord? I I I understood that little." I think Virgil has a kind of iceberg effect moment in which he gets a glimpse of what had been hidden beneath the surface of rationality. So I do with you, Mark, share sanguine and optimistic hopes for Dante's Virgil.
I think he learns in hell as well. I mean, there's the gates of Dis where he thinks he can open the gates and then can't, and like the angel comes, and at least he must have been set. Well, he is. He says, he's sort of set thinking about that, and so there is a sense of. Again, I don't think you can move through these domains unless you're learning in some way. It's when you're not learning, you stay stuck in a circle or in a bolger. That's for me partly what
I love
Dante.
that.
He's
Yeah.
taking evil and our incapacities absolutely seriously. He's not remotely just sort of ironing over them with a sort of a hot stone of mercy, as if that's all it takes. And because we are called in all our fullness to know the divine fullness. That's the only way to know the divine fullness, I think. And yet to just read it as if Dante's filling out beautifully and poetically a kind of blueprint for the way that the cosmos is ordered, I think that flattens and kills the divine life quite as effectively. Which is often, unfortunately, how the Divine Comedy is read. Can I just throw in one more name who you mentioned in passing, and then hand it back to you? Because another place where this comes out for me is when they have the encounter with Bruno Latino, and this is often in the commentaries just taken as this is the kind of the circle on the burning sands where the sodomites are. And yet I think, as you note, actually, if I remember right, in your little blurb at the beginning of the canto, that's not actually mentioned in the canto. And Bruno and Dante talk about being teachers and learning and so on. It feels at the very least something very, very oblique in reference to sodomy here. And to my mind, it's really about something else. And again, for me, this is, Dante correcting expectations and partly correcting Virgil, actually, too, because, Virgil had given his sort of blueprint of the lower circles higher up when they were hiding behind the tomb of the Pope, waiting for the stench to get easier. So this constant, this is what keeps it living for me as well, that it's the text itself unfolds even as you're reading it.
Yes. That moment in particular, Inferno 15, is with Brunetto Latini, is a very Boethian moment for me. You said earlier, you used a lovely phrase, what do you say, the fullness of divinity? What we are called to is the fullness of divinity. Boethius just calls that, of course, aeternitas, or eternity. And he says that eternity is the simultaneous possession of the fullness of life. So it's really interesting that Brunetto Latini, who's supposed to be, in whatever capacity was Dante's teacher, and is supposed to be Dante's teacher, tells him, I am the one who taught you how a man can make himself eternal, how a man can make himself immortal. But Brunetto seems, in light of Boethius, seems to be making a fundamental mistake. He seems to be conflating two possible goals for writers. One goal of a writer is to write a book so good that it'll be read by his grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren, right? The other writer wants to write about eternity so badly that it might actually turn out to be a good book if any of that eternity, if any of that divine fire gets into his book. But they're two very different motivations. One wants, in Boethius terms, perpetuity, an ongoingness throughout this life. The other wants the simultaneous fullness of the divine life to be present to whatever extent it can be within this sort of this temporal immortal realm. It seems that part of the drama of that particular scene is that Dante's own teacher had too small of goals for his pupil. I'll teach you how to get a New York Times bestseller, which I'll admit I would really like to have. But ultimately, if that's the extent of my goal, then within the grand scheme of our inner thirst for divine fullness, it's a very small thing to thirst for. And so I think in some sense this wonderful scene is a father-like figure whose vision of the world is sterile because it's locked in, as you said, Mark, it's locked into this sort of horizontal dimension and has lost this type of vertical dimension of continued growth. And in that sense, he's among the unfruitful. He's among the sterile for whatever other moral reason. He's just not touched. But seemingly Dante sort of suggests that at least his sort of this spiritual condition of sterility, of desiring objects which are too small, is at play in this midst of this conversation. And I think it's one of the most beautiful canti in all of Inferno, because what Dante has to do, and how many of us have had this experience as well, is he has to love people in their particularity. He has to love his parents, his old teachers, right? These old flawed people who have both helped him but are also incomplete as human beings. And so Dante, I think, just does something absolutely magnificent here. He loves his old teacher, Brunetto. He's grateful to him, however, he was his teacher, but he's grateful to his old teacher for what he's received from him. He's grateful for those types of ambitions which set him on this road that has made him him. And yet he can't pretend at the same time that his old teacher had the fullness of the picture. And that's the sort of painful kind of aspect in which, despite the fact that I love my people, I love my tribe, I love my, I love the people who gave me life and gave me spiritual formation. Ultimately, I'm bound by my own freedom and agency to perfect on their imperfections if I've seen them. And I think that's just a magnificently fugal, complicated moment right in the middle of Inferno.
Yeah, no, that's well put. And of course, even as you say that, it it keeps it real, it keeps it humane, and that must be a precondition for the possibility of grace. Even in that moment, if you get unreal or you start to gloss, then you lose the actual person in front of you. You prefer the map to the reality, if you like.
I'm so glad you said that because in one of Dante's treatises that he was working on just before he began the Inferno, an incomplete one called On Vernacular Eloquence, he has a very brief passing moment in which he mentions Brunetto Latini and he criticizes him. And he says that Brunetto Latini's way of his style, his way of using language was too provincial. It was too Tuscan and too Florentine. Isn't that interesting? He's too small in terms of his kind of linguistic ambitions, right? And so when Dante does meet Brunetto Latini in Inferno 15, these things are super, super hard to nail down and they require more learning than I have. But if I'm right, this is the most vernacular of all the canti. Surprise, surprise, two Florentine boys get back together and all their old habits of linguistic patterns start, sneaking back out. Like when I talk to my friend, also named Jason from Little Rock, and we start talking about our high school experience, our Arkansas accent starts re-emerging in the midst of it. I think something like that happens here, in which there are sort of Florentine words. Instead of saying casa, Brunetto just says ca, right? They start talking Florentine. They talk local together, and just your sort of talk about the embracing of people in their particularity. Dante here, while seemingly acknowledge Brunetto's provincialism, both in his mode of learning, both in his very ways of speech, both in terms of poetic and stylistic ambitions, not as ambitious as Dante's. Also loves him for being part of this of Dante's own vertical journey towards something of greater fullness.
Look, we should read, or I should read at least one sentence of your own translation.
Yeah,
And let me read the first opening canto, the opening verse of Canto 1, because it's
great.
very famous, and you do translate it in an interesting way. And so let me read it out, and then I'll say what it said to me, and see whether that chimes with you. So the famous opening lines are: midway along the path that makes for us a life, I found myself in the midst of a dark wood. Yes, the true way was lost. That's how you translate the first few lines. And it's particularly this opening famous line, midway along the path that makes for us a life. And that made me really think, because I don't know, a more common way of translating it into English would be something like midway upon the journey of our life, whereas you put the path that makes for us a life. And I like that, because immediately it's asking, who really possesses your life? Midway along the journey of our life is like, this is my life. I'm trotting along, and then I realize I've made a terrible mistake. Whereas I wonder whether you were intimating already that the path is given to us, and that's even in that opening line a sort of intimation of part of what must open up. That's what I heard in your translation. Now, it may be that you've just been much
Mm.
closer to Dante's original or something like that, which gets lost. But nonetheless, thoughts even on translating that opening line.
I'm really excited about the Vernon commentary on the Baxter translation. I can't wait to read it. Um, I think, I think that the motivation, well, two motivations there. One, I was worried about dead metaphors. And like you said, if it's a famous line, right, midway in the journey of our lives, um, and well, first of all, journey, right? Camino, right? It is a path. So I think I was worried one about if we just said midway along the journey of our lives, we might actually forget to feel the dynamism of the metaphor of a pilgrimage path, of a path that, well, can you imagine also sort of medieval travel, in which, I mean, we're so used to not only comfortable travel, but safe travel, right? But the path that, disappears into woods and has to go over mountains and could have sort of bridges which have fallen away for 100 years, right? This is a sort of dangerous and sort of dynamic metaphor, which I think sort of Dante captures. And so, one, I wanted to do something ever ancient and ever new, as Augustine puts it. I wanted to do something which woke up an ancient metaphor and made it feel like it was the first time that we had ever heard it. And then, secondly, um, in terms of what we said earlier of Dante's prolixitas, in his sort of great philosophical poems, what he calls a canzone, right? In his great canzone, Dante will sometimes allow a single sentence to not only go beyond line ends, not only go beyond stanza ends, but he'll allow a single sentence to meander for 15 lines in order to create that type of iconic still time floating feeling. He doesn't do that in Inferno. Oftentimes, the meaning of a sentence is wrapped up in a single line. It might flow over into the second line, but this thing is quick and fast. And so all of a sudden, the way of sort of punctuating a yes, I think was my way of sort of suggesting the pacing of this thing is going to be radically different than what we expected. Now, in English, we already have a paratactic language, right? In modern English, we already speak very straightforwardly, very frankly, right? Very bluntly. We prefer small sentences to our elaborate, Baroque ancestors. And so my thought was, if you want to make the abruptness and forcefulness and speed of this evident, we have to do that relative to how we ordinarily speak now. Thus, there's going to have to be some additional sort of charged linguistic energy in that, and that's all of a sudden, the yes, the true way was lost. Yeah,
Hey, no, thank you. That's very fascinating. A little glimpse into the translator's task as well, trying to convey the spirit, understand the spirit, as well as the actual words themselves.
yeah.
Um,
It's a difficult and seemingly in the final analysis impossible task, because it's an analogy of proportions. I think what you have to do is ask, what was standard Italian in Dante's day? First of all, there wasn't, which is part of the problem. What did Dante, or what was standard in Dante's imagination? And we can get a little bit of mileage by reading his On Vernacular Eloquence and then seeing how he didn't do what he promised that he would do. And we can look at those and sort of see those moments of transgression of the horizon of his expectations. But then we have to say, okay, well, what is English now? What is standard English? And to a certain extent, there isn't such a thing, right? But, and then we have to do analogous effects to our own language. What this means is the ideal translation, the perfect translation would be made by a tremendous poet who could take his own language and transform it analogously to how Dante did his. And it also would mean that you would need a tremendous philologist. You would need someone to understand absolutely every aspect, every coinage, every borrowing. Why does Dante use a word which would have been more common in northwestern Italy, where they had French influences, as opposed to more normal Tuscan Italian? And that requires a lifetime of learning. So, in some sense, to do these two things well, you would need at least 75 years of intense learning in both of these domains, which of course is impossible for us in this brief life. But hopefully, to a certain extent, by getting those two protons and colliding them together, hopefully, you have something of an explosion in Dante's particle accelerator.
yeah, I mean, that's actually the consolation for me of reading the Divine Comedy in translation, is that you have to read more than one translation, and perhaps things then come to the surface that if you're just reading it, well, if you can read, Dante's Italian today fairly naturally, you might actually miss, because you don't realize quite what's going on to make that word the word that's there, and so on.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right. Because
it
in
does make you
Dante's
think.
day, Italian wasn't an art language, right? For us, Italy, this wonderful place of piazzas and, you know, and duomos and opera and fashion and, meticulous detail about, cuisine and presentation and, poetry and Michelangelo. I mean, just it's swimming through our heads, through our movies, through our visiting, so forth, right? But for us, Italy is the artistic country par excellence. It wasn't that yet for Dante. And so in some sense, we have to, and Dante is the beginning of that long tradition by which it becomes that sort of thing. But for Dante, as I like to jokingly put it for my American readers, right? For Dante, Florentine, Tuscan had all the prestige of the Alabama dialect in the United States, right? It's just a local way of speaking. And Dante both takes that thing as its base, its sort of, shockingly rootedness in a particular territory and sort of linguistic humility, right? If we think of that in terms of the full etymology, right? It's rooted in the language of a terroir, right? Of a particular region. And also has to do all of this work of aspiring for cosmological harmonic Pythagorean patterns simultaneously. That's the magic of the thing, is that he's trying to move in two different directions at the same time.
Well, you know what that means for you is that you can't just translate the Inferno. You have to do the Purgatorio and the Paradiso as well. You can't just stop with the final stars of the Inferno. You have to get to the stars that end the Purgatory and the Paradiso.
That's the plan.
Have you got that in mind? I mean, is that something you might?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah,
Good.
absolutely. And I think but it's kind of exciting. I guess I can give a sneak peek um to your listeners that I think the I think the sort of the shock of the vernacular, the shock of the rootedness. Not there. Of course, there is some obscenity in Dante, and it was very, very shocking to his medieval readers. But it also just sort of shock and sometimes the low register, the earthiness and bodiliness of some of Dante's choices of words, his choices of sounds. That continues. Now it continues to a lesser extent, but in the midst of purgatory, Dante continues to, even as he's beginning to aspire to something, we might say, okay, if Inferno is heavy metal music, or you know, prog rock or post rock or whatever, and Purgatorio is the string quartet of Schubert or Mozart, of someone who's just sort of liquid, liquid melodiousness, and I think Purgatorio begins to move in that direction and yet it's still punctuated by these words of humility, these words in which we sort of stoop down in this kind of Franciscan way, and embrace the particularity of our bodily lives. Ultimately, in Paradiso, if you go from the heavy metal of hell to the Schubert of Purgatorio, for me, Paradiso more than anything else feels like Hopkins, and it's dense and it's poetic and it's slow and it's labyrinthine and it's enigmatic, and it's layered, and ultimately Dante gets to that sort of fugal complexity. But that's the kind of the quick vision of the triptych, the linguistic triptych, from at least from this perspective before doing more laboratory experiments.
Yeah, well, I look forward particularly to the Paradiso actually because I feel like that's the most important one because it's the canticle that so easily just gets dropped off when people say they don't
Mm.
understand, and that was okay for a late medieval figure like Dante, but doesn't really speak to us now. But as Dante says at the beginning of the Paradiso, the journey is only just really beginning now. Everything else would be in a kind of preparation.
I love how you've articulated that vision. Whether I'll do it or not will remain to be seen. But I think that will be my inspiration, to create a paradiso, which makes it unavoidably important even for our age, in which we can feel it again. We can feel the sort of linguistic magic of why Dante himself thought it was his greatest accomplishment.
Look, on that wonderful note, and I use the words advisedly given what you've been saying about music, maybe we'll draw things to a close. But just to say, it's wonderful to have another translation, because reading different translations is so valuable. And I, really, and also your introduction too, actually, I very much appreciated you trying to get to grips with what Dante wanted to say, and taking that very seriously, not sort of doing a kind of postmodern literary turn and just reading the text for its own sake. So it's been lovely talking again, Jason, about these things. And I look forward to speaking again at some point.
Thank you so much.